Добрый день, огромное спасибо за приглашение выступить сегодня перед вами. Это большая честь для меня.
Perfect Russian. Thank you very much. We do appreciate it.
Я надеюсь, лекция вам понравится, и пожалуйста, задавайте вопросы, буду рад ответить. All right, итак, начнем. Today I would like to briefly discuss free will, and I'm not sure if you will move the slides or if there's any way I could share my screen, whichever works best for you. Would you like me to move the slides, or should you just talk?
Максима, у нас его презентация. Change the slides. Just let us know when to change. Just a moment.
Yeah.
On the screen. Your Russian was so perfect, so we lost control.
Thank you.
Now we can see the yes slide.
All right. Wonderful, fantastic. Great. All right, so let me begin with a general overview. This is a very brief discussion on free will, and I know that the time is limited, so I'm not going to try to discuss the history of philosophy on the problem of free will since time immemorial. I'll try to be very brief and focus on three main areas. So philosophical understanding, psychological analysis, and neural correlates, neural underpinnings. So the first thing I want to mention is that with brain as basis, the general idea is let's start to see what areas in the brain could justify the existence or lack thereof for human free will, at least. If you don't mind going to the next slide, please. So as you can see here, there are different areas. I just want to focus on a few colors for now. And then I will discuss why I prefer to begin with neurology or neuroscience. So the first thing I want to mention here is that you should take a look at the blue and the green color from this brain diagram on top on each side. And the general idea is that with the blue area here, we identify the frontal lobe, and more specifically the prefrontal cortex, which is usually associated with a variety of skills such as rational decision-making, veto powers, executive function, and so on and so forth. And right behind it, we are at the connection in proximity to the central sulcus, which is quite fascinating because that's where you find both the motor cortex that allows us to move our limbs, and in the back, the somatosensory map. What does that mean? Well, this is where the brain finds itself in space. That's where we have this phenomenon called proprioception. What do we mean by proprioception? We mean more than just perception. We mean the ability of the body to perceive itself in space and interact with the space. So as you can imagine, when we talk about free will, we cannot exist but in the world. And this, of course, is touching upon a variety of historical or context-based perspectives. And you can think of the Frankfurt School, you can think of Hegel, you can think of Heidegger. But the focus that I want to embrace here is what do we mean by action potential? What do we mean by the ability to understand how we are ready, this readiness potential? And that is the next slide, please. All right. So a selective problem, evidence versus eminence. In my field, so philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, medicine, we tend to embrace the scientific method by which we understand empirical knowledge. So something that can be demonstrated in the lab, and something that's usually answering the question on a binary scale, so either a yes or no. Think about taking a medication, right? The way you discuss and verify the effectiveness, efficacy, and efficiency of the medication is to have what we call a randomized controlled trial, clinical case controlled trial, in which you give a pill to one group of people, possibly equivalent, and you give a placebo to the other one. Now, in this slide, I mentioned this. At the beginning of any serious inquiry into the ontological nature of a human being, one must face the selective problem of deciding which areas of investigation and related methods to incorporate in such analysis, and which areas one ought to reject. Now, I'm not advocating a separation or a confrontation between empirical science and theoretical philosophy here. What I'm trying to eviscerate here is that very often science masks itself, or rather scientists mask themselves by appealing to their authority rather than by the intrinsic power of what they're trying to demonstrate. In this sense, we understand evidence, what you can find in the lab, as opposed to eminence. I just believe the doctor because he or she is famous. All right? So let's see how we can find evidence in the context of free will. Next slide, please. So, readiness potential, in German Bereitschaftspotenzial. This is one of the most famous research studies on the area of the neural underpinnings of free will. And it's a study that dates back to the 80s, and in itself was based on a previous theoretical and empirical research by Kornhuber and Decker. Benjamin Libet, his real name is really Libitsky, but after he moved to the US, he goes by Libet. He came out with this experiment in which he tried to monitor the delay between volition, perceived volition, and action. In short, the subjects were asked to identify on a screen the specific time according to which they move, let's say, their finger, or they press a button, and the experiment attempted to verify the delay in time between the action itself, pressing the button, how the brain perceived the motor cortex activating the hand, and what the subject thought they decided to move the hand. So, what does that mean? This experiment appeared to demonstrate that indeed we do not have free will. Why? Because the experiment showed, at first at least, that there was a significant delay between what the brain perceived the action to start, and you could see all this action potential on the screen. And to be fair, this experiment was nowhere near the technological advances we have nowadays. It wasn't an fMRI, it was just a pretty basic technology at the time on the surface, on the epidermal surface of the brain. But nevertheless, there was a delay of a few milliseconds between how the subject thought they would move the finger and what actually the display showed. So it appeared that the subject thought of moving his or her hand after the brain already, quote unquote, decided to move the hand. So this seemed to indicate that it is the brain that was in charge, not me as myself, so to speak. Okay? So 2 points here. A, the decision of taking action precedes the action itself, and B, recollecting something is meaningful, true in a scientific sense, only if this something happened or existed before the act of recollection. All right? Now, I mentioned here, leaving mistakes interpretation aside, by the way, I misspelled living here, living as living behind, not living as in existing. Experiments like this are connected to the concept of recollection, thus involving an objective versus subjective perception of the passing of time. So, a lot of neuroscientists believe that this was the proof that human free will did not exist. Now, before we move on to the next slide, I just want to mention that most recent research, and I'm talking about the last 6 to 9 months, clearly indicated that the experiment wasn't necessarily faulty. It simply was doomed to give outcomes that were predicated upon a relatively underdeveloped technology. Nowadays, we actually see that either, and this depends how you interpret the results, either the action and the thought happen simultaneously, or actually the thought precedes the action. So in other words, the subject decides in her or his mind what to do before the movement occurs. Now let's move on to the next slide, please. So brain, I wouldn't say versus mind, but at least not equal and not equivalent, mathematically speaking, to mind. So let's read this slide first. A recollective approach, which is solidly aligned with current neuroscientific evidence, indicates similar consideration for the veto power of the free want problem, as in the research by the Berlin group led by Haynes, indicating that a speed activation competition between human subjects and a brain-computer interface, the point of no return, which again is this delay, for the ability of humans to veto an action was at 200 milliseconds before the movement. What does it mean? Yet again, we do possess free will not only when we decide to do something, we decide to move something, but also when we decide not to move something, not to do something. Among the most important aspects of climate analysis, we should evidence that both concepts of decision and conscious realization need to be reassessed in the context of evidence-based experimentation. More specifically, understanding that the processes underlying decision-making are multiple. And therefore, point A, they cannot be reduced to a single mental process to be analyzed, and B, they cannot be used as a basis or experimental justification for all mental life. Let me take a little break here. What do I mean to say here? I mentioned a few researchers earlier in a few slides. I mentioned Daniel Dennett and the whole materialist, reductionist, atheist, like Richard Dawkins, like Bennett, like many others. But I also mentioned the Churchlands, especially Patricia Churchland, who is a neurophilosopher. That's how she likes to refer herself as, and she works here in the U.S. And she's famously, how can I phrase this? She is a philosopher who regrets being one, as in the fact that, that's my view, the fact that she put this neuro in front of philosopher simply appears to make herself sound more scientific, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but she's one to reject all non-experimental justification, and by virtue of doing that, she actually, in my opinion, projects a lot of non-experimental factors on her views. As in, there's a famous quote by her where she says, if we have any scientific advancement, it will not be due to a philosopher thinking hard about a problem, but only based on what we find in the lab. And this is, in my view, very superficial, misses the point completely. And of course, there is a difference between profound philosophical analysis and a so-called driven philosopher, of course. But you don't put the neurological part in opposition to the theoretical part, because guess what? In the lab, numbers do not lie, but they also do not tell the truth. Numbers are numbers. It's up to us to interpret them. Let's see how we do that. Next slide, please. Neuroregulation. This is one of the slides that always make me think, this one and the next two slides, gotcha. Which is pretty much the fact that neuroscience actually appears to indicate the correct approach of certain philosophical methodology, phenomenology included, I dare to say. Let's see what this slide says. On a neurological level, the activation and perception of free will and related emotional, cognitive, behavioral responses follow a bottom-up or top-down regulation. So here we focus on the triad. I'm also a psychologist, and so very often, in order to help patients, we focus on these three main areas. We focus on emotions, emotional, we focus on thoughts, cognition, and then we focus on action, behavior. Well, this is not to say that some analytical psychology or psychoanalytical psychology is wrong. I'm personally more in tune with people like Rudolf Allers or Rank or Carl Gustav Jung than I am in tune with Freud, which at this point seems to have more of an issue himself rather than an issue with the scientific method. But in any case, the reason why we focus on these three areas is because we can detect right away, or hopefully with a certain amount of valid time, what the problem is. We don't have any powers as doctors, as psychologists, to read people's mind. At least I don't. And so the least we can do is asking the person about emotion, thoughts, and behavior, or simply observing them. So to some extent, this is very empirically based. It's observational based. It's not necessarily ontological based, unless we can verify the nature of that justified in the brain. Second part of this slide, the cortical signaling happens via the ACC, or the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the front area in blue, all right, and the posterior cingulate cortex, PCC, which has to do with a perceptual conflict, which is the back area, the area in the back, also in blue. The subcortical signal via the cerebellum, temporal violation, and the basal ganglia, frequency violation. And the prefrontal cortex implements control through selection and judgment, or biasing relevant signals. What does that mean? Well, first of all, I really don't like using acronyms because I feel they create more confusion, but I guess at least in America, people tend to rush through things, so they don't take the time to discuss things. So the PCC and ACC, etc. But what I want to focus on here is that you have different areas in the brain that are responsible, and I don't mean their causal factor, their underlying mechanism, for response conflict, perceptual conflict, temporal violation, and frequency violation. So in other words, the brain is able to work in cooperation with the subject to detect things around them, and interestingly enough, those areas are adjunct, they're touching one another. So just look how close the prefrontal cortex in yellow is to the ACC, to the anterior cingulate cortex. All right? This is by no means a chance. What happens is that we have proximity of activation that allows us to choose to have informed decision. And the more we are informed, in Latin, able to morph, to change accordingly, the more, you can say, intelligent our actions are going to be. Not only that, but unless we have a cooperation between rationality, so to speak, and emotional background, our decision will not be fully informed. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So the next slide, again, has to do with the difference between brain and mind, but it moves on to a slightly different area. In the interpretation by Kornhuber and Acad, there are ways human beings can increase the level of freedom through an improvement of the self, as opposed to self-mismanagement and certain form of self-improvement, which would lead to an incremental loss of degrees of such freedom. This interpretation is fully consistent with those religious perspectives according to which the concept of sin and repentance involve an external source of judgment and activation, because we as human beings, part of the world and in this world, cannot have full free will, as it will entail complete freedom from nature, which we are part of. So, in other words, the idea here is that free will can be developed. There is an improvement of the self. There is something that is given to us, and there's something that allows us to move past the temporal judgment. In other words, our knowledge is not full unless we rely on something ulterior. Now, I'm very careful not to throw concepts and words such as religion, theology, and spirituality without lack of justification here. And hold on for a few more seconds. There will be a slide where the justification will come. But at least from the perspective of neuroscience, there is a full alignment between what the greatest religious tradition had to say for centuries, or in some cases millennia, and what those neural underpinnings actually show. Now, this image here next to the description, those two purple, reddish, almond-shaped glands are the amygdalae in the brain, and amygdala is really Greek for almond, and they are responsible for the fight or flight response. And so they're kind of they're red flag bearers. They're activating an alarm when we feel either threatened or we have fear or we need to have a response. And in the brain, from the brain perspective, most of our choices are predicated upon danger and fear. Either the brain thinks, or in cooperation with us, we think that we can fight a problem, and so we get ready for fight, or we need to escape the problem. Okay? They're activated the same way as an engine in the car is ready for putting some extra gas, some rounds per minute, some power, right? And the more a person is, quote unquote, stressed out, the more they are hyperactivated. Think about, soldiers or police officers that are trained to be always on alert, so their amygdala need to fire up more quickly because they had to be aware of the circumstance and need to be ready to fight. The downside of that is that their amygdala might always be too ready to fight, and so they might be overly stressed. So we are a part of nature, and so let's see how this turns out to be indicative of the existence of free will or lack thereof. Next slide, please. All right, so this is one of the key slides in this presentation, and again, I'm trying to be mindful of your time. Judgment and impact. This is one of the slides where I feel we are defending and justifying philosophy because philosophical methodology has a direct impact on our lives. So there are two levels in my estimation. One is where philosophy actually is theoretical in the most profound sense of the term, where it allows us to detect within ourselves truth that cannot be fully obtained in the lab. So in other words, I completely disagree with people like the Churchlands, according to which philosophy is something that one embraces if they don't master enough science. Quite the opposite. Deep philosophy requires a very profound, attention-based investigation. But it also has very practical outcomes, practical application. So let me read this slide. This philosophical interpretation is fully supported by neuroscientific evidence. For instance, the series of studies by Sartori and Defanti, and the substantiated claim that our belief in the existence of free will has the power to impact the readiness potential. Again, the readiness potential is this Bereitschaftspotential that we just see, the delay. And has this power to impact this potential positively, in other words, with a decrease in time, so that we are quicker in making decisions, or negatively, with an increase in extension of time, by virtue of our judgment of this positivity or negativity, with string neuron connection to cognitively driven versus emotionally driven action or response. So let me first point out what this slide says, the little image, the little diagram on the right side, and then how we justify what we just read. First thing first, I mentioned these studies, and these studies are published in 2012. And this is just a little parenthesis I want to open. When we are in the lab or when we do research and we are teaching either medicine or medical science, neuroscience, etc., the general advice is to refer to publications that are very recent. I would say within the last 7 years. So 2012, it's 10 years ago. So technically speaking, is already old. And yet this is in itself quite biased. This will require a whole hour of discussion, so I promise I'll keep it brief. But the idea is that, of course, we should know what the current research is telling us. But there's always an issue. And it's an issue that, in my mind, it's an issue between mixing politics with science in a very cult-like perspective. In other words, there are certain researchers outside of biomedical science, usually, let's put it, theoretical researchers, that might have a specific worldview, which is in opposition to other scientists that only focus in the lab. Figuratively speaking, you could say that conservative scientists are obsessed with the past. They want to conserve the past. By default, however, quote-unquote progressive scientists are obsessed with the future and an ever-improving paradigm. What does it mean? Well, it means that for the obsessive, progressive scientists, anything that's older than 2012 is to be discarded. Doesn't matter if you can read philosophy by Plato and Aristotle and how much knowledge there is. Well, they're just too old, therefore we just discard it. They're old, they didn't know better. Which is complete nonsense in my mind. Or Aquinas and many others. Or the opposite, that there are some people that think that just because something is old, it has to be true. Think about medicine, for instance. Well, bloodletting to cure diseases being, practiced since time immemorial, therefore it's good. Now, of course, this is also nonsense. How does it apply to this? Well, I tend to take an in-between perspective. There are research studies that should be considered nowadays, but we had to be more mindful of how time passes in general, okay? Because our current scientific evidence, it's not the full evidence there is. So in this slide, you can see on top the cortex right here, then the limbic system in blue in the center, and finally the response. I'm Italian, so of course I put a Michelangelo reproduction here, so just because. So in blue, the two blue arrows indicate a cognitively driven response. What does it mean? That our cortex, our prefrontal cortex, decides in a factual way, in a rational way, to activate the limbic system and therefore obtain a response. So from, you could say, rational thought through emotion and then response. And then you have the emotionally driven paradigm, the emotionally driven process, which occurs in the limbic system and affects both thoughts on one side and a response on the other side. Now, this is essential because it really goes against what certain psychoanalysis has to say. Like, think about Freud, according to which it's almost pointless to even mention the fact that we might have free will because we are all messed up as human beings, and therefore we can either spend our time being repressed or suppressed by societal morality, or if we just give in to our animalesque self, our instinctual self, our id or is in German, we will just either destroy the world or do immoral things, etc., etc. Now, what the brain actually indicates is more consistent with what solid theology has to say, which is, yes, we do have a lot of commonality with other animals, but we're also intrinsically and ontologically distinct from other animals, including mammals, including primates. And what makes us distinct is our ability to reason, to use cognition properly, and of course, language. So it's not so much that we will find freedom if we liberate ourselves from the construction of society, but if we are again in charge. If we put ourselves again, not on a pedestal, but on the throne of cognition. We are mastering our emotion. We don't allow our emotions to control us, but we also do not repress them. We incorporate them. Next slide, please. All right. You might wonder, okay, a mini lecture on free will and neuroscience. What has Thomas Aquinas to do with all of this? Okay? And of course, I'm a big fan of the work by Aquinas and his inspiration, so Aristotle, And let's see what Aquinas had to tell us about this discussion here. And again, by no means I will attempt to sum up the whole Summa Theologica of Aquinas here, but just a few things. True intersectionality, integrity, support, recognition. Neuroscience also informs our current understanding, so empirical understanding, of Thomistic perspective regarding perceptual modalities in human beings, including our 5 senses plus the sensus divinitatis, the sense of the divine, you could say, okay? In orthodoxy, we could mention theosis as an example, okay? The ability to become godlike. And more importantly, for the purpose of this area of analysis, the sensus communis, the common sense, which of course is not common at all. Free will is consistent with the ultimate good in the sense that it is contained by it, or is a manifestation of it, an epiphania. Okay? Again, it is a power for the good, not freedom for freedom itself. So in this sense, this is what we need to conserve. This is the knowledge that is already defended and quote-unquote proven by science, and it's also the type of knowledge that is outside of time and space. So again, we should not embrace knowledge just because it's new or just because it's old. We should embrace this type of knowledge because it is true. Next slide, please. I'm aware of the time, so this will be the last slide before conclusion. So, there are a variety of areas of the brain that at times were indicative of where free will could be contained. 2 glands that are very, very important in the scientific literature are the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, as you can see in the image. Now, the pineal gland was one of those areas that René Descartes, Cartesius, the philosopher Cartesius, of course, attempted to indicate as a possible area where free will was located in the brain. And I would say in hindsight, rightfully so. There's a lot of things about the pineal gland that appears to be a modulating brain within the brain. Modulating areas that combines emotions and thought, etc. The pituitary gland very often is considered the master gland because it really creates an interface between thalamic and hypothalamic activation and the cortex. It's a kind of a relay. It's kind of a director, all right? And so that's precisely why I decided to include this, because it's about connection, not about distinction. And yet, if we don't distinguish things, we cannot understand things. And that's why I am personally quite critical of certain attempts to how can I say this? To give into globalization, political globalization, cultural globalization, and overall flattening of culture, where we pretend that everybody is the same. I would say, thank God we have the ability to distinguish, select, and separate things, because that's how we construct hierarchical understanding of reality. Let's see what the slide says. If we did not incorporate this ontological hierarchy in our understanding of human free will, 2 things could happen. A, any therapeutic intervention would be pointless, given the absence of basic biological existence, as in the case of patient committing suicide. And B, there will be an a priori rejection of the skills, training, scope of practice, clinical medical goals, and even basic human understandings. Think of the research by Giacomo Rizzolatti on mirror neurons. A psychotherapist has, since this professional should be trained to see the good, the beauty, and the potential of the person he or she works with, despite or against the fact that the patient is not able to recognize them yet within himself or herself. What does that mean? That if we are embracing a fully reductionist, materialist an anti-free will perspective, we can certainly pretend that it does not exist, but we would still live as if it existed. In other words, what justification could I have as a doctor, as a psychotherapist, a psychologist, to tell my patients, no, you should not commit suicide, you should not harm yourself? Of course, this sense of morality is extrinsic and external from the perspective of biological science, and yet is entirely justified by the way the brain reacts. Some people might want to discard this as, well, it's just a question of evolutionary biology, which I might even agree with. But just because you see the evolution in biochemical specifically, or chemical and electric signaling perspective, as in the action potential, by no means this indicates the why we should support the healing path in the process. Now, I mentioned here mirror neurons. I really have, few seconds left, so I'm going to conclude. Mirror neurons are part of this research that indicates that not only we learn vicariously by observing how to, let's say, move around, ride a bicycle, to some extent learn a language, but we also learn how to properly interact emotionally in the world. And so the brain indeed justifies this perspective. The last two slides, please, and I conclude. So conclusion. This is just a nice developmental neuroscience image here that I simply want to put there because there's also beauty in the way science describes these things, and in the context of fetal development, our brain, our spinal cord, our central nervous system kind of blossoms like a flower, just like this. It blossoms, and interesting enough, the limbic system is the innermost part of the development, just as a flower, the kern, and then the petals are the prefrontal cortex, which is the very last part of the brain to develop, and it's the higher part, the things that makes us human, our ability to be intelligent, as in reading between the lines, our ability to use rationality. Very last slide, please. All right. So I am finished with my presentation, but some people might say, okay, well, thank you very much. I'm still not convinced that neuroscience is the way to understand free will. I believe in science, etc., but ultimately, it's still your opinion. So the question here is this all opinions or facts? Why do we have to even mention the brain in the concept of free will in a philosophical distinction? I just want to answer with an etymological analysis. Opinions come from the Latin opinare, or Italian opinare, which has a very interesting etymology to it. Opinare, or giving, producing an opinion, means first, touching with the eye, reaching with the eye, creating with the eye, which in itself is based on the Sanskrit root op, think of the Greek word opsis, thus apperception, grasping, seeing, grasping as conceptualizing. Think about the concept of Begriff, for instance, okay, in the phenomenology of the spirit. Or touching with the mind, reaching with the mind, creating with the mind, based on the Sanskrit root ap, as found in, interesting enough, opus or opera in Latin. So yes, you could discard everything as opinion, but you still have the opportunity to develop your free will so that your opinion will be able to be crystal clear, piece through reality, and apprehend reality as the ultimate truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your profound analysis of the problem of free will. This philosophical question usually interests our students very much, and you presented us with a modern view on this problem. In my opinion, we can't speak about human consciousness or man in general without including neuroscientists, but nowadays we can't ignore them. But we certainly can find some wisdom in the ancient teachings as well, I think. And we appreciate your sense of humor and the turning of your phrases. Especially, I liked the philosopher who is not what was the turn of the phrase? Philosopher who is not happy to be a philosopher. That was very interesting.
Yes.
Going into sciences. Second, when you see that philosophy is not enough. Probably my colleagues have some questions or comments.
Yes, then, thank you very much. It is a very informative concept, and it is quite unknown for me personally. And I found that it is compulsory to modern epistemological approach of cognition. Is that true?
Yes, we agree with that. Now, of course, the main issue here is that, talking about opinion, are we agreeing that we should embrace epistemology as a method? And I am a little careful here, because on one side, I'm fully embracing certain, let's call them postmodernist perspective. Okay, I put everything in the same basket. Okay, so everybody from the Frankfurt School all the way to Sartre and Camus and Derrida, etc. As in, we should just be aware of the fact that as scientists, we are biased. We are human beings, we are fallible, so we are biased. So an epistemological understanding of the method is necessary. However, I also want to point out that this is at least in the United States. That's what I'm observing in the US. I'm not sure if it's true for many other parts of the world, but in the US, we took on a fully postmodernist perspective without actually knowing what postmodernism is. As in, we toss, that's a saying in English, we toss the baby with the bathwater. As in, well, everything is up for discussion, we have no more certainties, and so epistemology is simply to defend things that are completely unrelated to science, as a way to just appear to be tolerant or inclusive. We just discard the whole method, and that's really what concerns me. This completely lack of grounding, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I have another opinion on this, but still I consider your point. And from this point, it is I would call a kind of emotional cognition. Emotional cognition. When we use this term, emotional cognition.
Sorry, are you asking me about my view on emotional cognition, or?
No, I just trying to find the keyword to make an interpretation of free will in your approach. And so I see that emotions is absolutely different from the epistemological point of view.
Oh yeah.
There are values, but not emotions.
Sure. Yeah, you have a very big point here. So on one side, I would say that distinction is proper, as in, well, first of all, we have very different circuitry in the brain that are responsible for emotions on one side and cognition on the other side. We could also make the claim that epistemology is entirely cognition-based. It's not emotion-based, hopefully, as in, I would not just claim something based on how I feel. My wife might disagree with me, but at least I would try to be perceived as rational. But in any case, there are indeed some research analysis, and on top of my head, I can think of the research by Damasio in Brazil, Antonio Damasio, that really indicates that indeed there are some neural circuitry that are entirely emotional that are indeed predictors of epistemological analysis, as in the application of rational thought to distinguish reality. Now, it's almost the problem of the chicken and the egg in my mind. Which comes first? Is it first emotions and then cognition? Is it first cognition and then emotions? Well, at least we can tell where something happens. In the slide that I mentioned, the top down, it clearly appears that the brain, when it's not fully developed, only relies on emotions. And then when it's fully developed, either in a sequential sense, and this happens around the age of 18 and a half for female subjects and about 19 and a half for male subjects. When it's fully developed in the context of the prefrontal cortex, emotions are not discarded, but they're actually interpreted. So you could say this, that a young brain or an unexperienced brain relies on emotions not because emotions are false, or that not even because they're a partial truth, but because they don't have the ability to understand it. They exist, they live, they perceive, and there's a difference in that sense. Think about Derrida in this sense. So that's the I would say the postmodern perspective. And then when the full cognitive apparatus is intact, it really looks like the brain is applying an epistemological method to better understand and inform their decision. At least that's what current research indicates.
Thank you. I'll try to read your recent works to understand better your concept because it looks very interesting for me.
Oh, thank
Again,
you.
thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.